All right, everyone. So let's talk about how this World War One finally comes to an end. And we talked about the Western Front, covered the Eastern Front, talked about obviously the Armenian genocide. I mentioned that in the last lecture. The Western Front, the stalemate. The Eastern Front, much more mobile. What will happen in the Eastern Front is by 1918, March of 1918, Russia is going to pull out of the war. And the question, of course, is that's not going to help, England at all, right? Because they needed the Russian help. So what is it that finally brings the war to an end and gives victory for the British and the French and so forth? And the answer to that, of course, is going to be the United States getting involved in World War One. So I briefly want to talk about, this isn't a U.S. history course, but it still obviously overlaps. I still want to briefly talk about how the U.S. gets involved in World War One, and then how this finally leads to the end of the war. So there's a few things, in terms of how the United States gets involved in World War One. And again, if you watch that movie, The Kingsman, I think I mentioned it in one of the other earlier lectures. They actually mentioned some of this stuff, and it's kind of interesting how they mentioned it, and they of course dramatized a whole bunch of it as well. But there's a few things that were happening. So one of the things is the U.S. definitely did not want Germany to win, right? Initially, when the war began, the U.S. was very neutral. The President of the United States, again, all these key words you're going to need to know. Woodrow Wilson, of course. He's like, I don't want to get in the war, and it was very neutral at the start of the war. But there's still this sense that they didn't want the Germans to win, but they weren't ready to jump into a war either at this point. And so in 1915, of course, there was the very infamous event of the Lusitania. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Lusitania was a British passenger ship. It was sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, and it would be sunk by the German U-boats. The U-boats, of course, the German submarines. And when this happened, there were Americans on this boat as well. There were, I think, like 1,200 people who died, like 100 Americans who died. And it was a horrible thing. Now, the Germans told people, hey, we're going to sink ships that are crossing the Atlantic Ocean, even passenger ships like the Lusitania. And you go, why would they sink passenger ships? Well, because there were supplies and ammunitions that were often on these ships that were going to help the British against the Germans. And so the Germans knew this. They warned people, hey, you're on these boats, you could be sunk. And of course, the Lusitania was sunk. And so that definitely aggravated things, but that was still not enough to get the U.S. into the war. So the question is, what is enough to get the U.S. into the war? And that happens in 1917, when there's the story of a man named Arthur Zimmermann. And Zimmermann was a German foreign minister who sends what is known as the Zimmermann telegram. And he sends this telegram from Germany to Mexico City. Here you see German to Mexico City. It's all coded, right? It's all a bunch of codes. And what eventually is discovered is this telegram is intercepted by the British. The British intercept this telegram, and what does it say? It basically says, Dear Mexico, if you go and fight against the United States and occupy the United States now in a war, then after we're done fighting against the British, we'll come back, we'll help you gain some of the land you lost in, like, the Mexican-American War and so forth. And so this telegram was meant to go to Mexico. It would be intercepted by the British would find it, and they would decode it. And when they decoded it, they told everybody what it means. And you could see this cartoon here, this very stereotypical cartoon using all the, stereotypes of the various groups, with a German talking to somebody. This is a cartoon from the time, and it says, join with Germany and get a little bit of the United States. And it's this German guy speaking to a guy who's supposed to be, who represents somebody from Mexico. And this telegram was there. Now, it's legit. This telegram is real. People have asked me, did this really happen? It really happened. But the bigger question is, would Mexico have actually been part of all this? And the answer is probably not. I don't think Mexico is ready to jump into a war against the United States at this point. But it was the thing that really Woodrow Wilson and other people in the United States used to say, hey, we need to fight against the Germans. They're coming after our home front too. So between these passenger ships being sunk, and it wasn't just the Lusitania, there'll be other ships sunk as well. And in the Zimmermann telegram, as we get into 1917, the United States says, we're in. Now, when the United States enters the war, this changes the tide of the war very quickly, right? Because within a short time, the U.S. is able to put in about 300,000 fresh soldiers every month into this war. And, think of the resources the United States has. They haven't been in this war, they've industrialized, they've modernized, they have all this technology, all this fresh manpower and weaponry. And in the Europe, they've been fighting this since 1914 in these horrible trenches. They're tired, they're worn out. And this really changes the tide of the war fairly quickly. How does it all come to an end? Well, by the time we get to 1917, 1918, the Germans, just to give you some perspective, they have to pass what is called the German Auxiliary Service Law, which basically stated every male, I believe between the ages of 18 and 65 in Germany, had to have some sort of job directly related to the war. You either had to be a soldier, you had to be making weapons or something, because they were just down to so few men. Every single person had to in some way be part of the war. Meanwhile, the United States is putting 300,000 fresh soldiers into the front every month. The Germans see this. They plan what is called the Ludendorff Offensive in 1918, which was this kind of some people argue, the last-ditch effort by the Germans to break the Western Front before too many soldiers come in. It fails. And once the Ludendorff Offensive fails, at that point, Germany just looks at the situation and they realize they're done. And so they surrender. And that happens on a very specific moment, actually. And I put it up here, 11/11/11/1918. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. Now, again, if you're aware of your surroundings and what goes on in our nation, November 11th should also resonate with people because, folks, that is Veterans Day, right? Initially, it wasn't Veterans Day. It was Armistice Day for World War I, and then it became Veterans Day. And so, one of my little personal pet peeves is, we take a lot of our holidays and we move them to Mondays and they lose all meaning. And I always, and some places do this, some places don't, but a lot of schools they'll take off on a Monday as opposed to November 11th if it falls on a Wednesday, because it's more important to have a day to reflect and thank the veterans as opposed to a day on a Monday to go and do extra shopping, right? But that's something that's always one of my pet peeves, because I think if people actually celebrated Veterans Day on Veterans Day every year, it would have more meaning. But that's where it comes from. It comes from the end of World War I. So that's it. With the U.S. coming in, it changes the tide of the war very quickly. The U.S. is able to get the upper hand with the British, of course, and the Germans have to surrender. So now what? Well, we're not completely done, because now we need to talk about the rest of the situation. And so the rest of the situation involves this concept of total war. So I've done my lecturing bit on World War I. You have the documentaries you're going to watch on the war as well. When you watch the documentaries, one is about the battles. You definitely want to know a little bit, get some details down, Battle of Verdun, Battle of Somme. Another one is a documentary on total war. And that one I really want you to take a lot of good notes on. It's really powerful. If you pay attention, the narration is also done by people like Liam Neeson and Jeremy Irons, all these kind of old school folks. And it covers all sorts of effects. What do we mean by total war? Total war, it explains it in that documentary about how everybody's involved. It's not just a war with soldiers. And so when you watch that documentary in next week's modules, you want to take a lot of good notes on that. So that's part of the impacts of World War I want you to know. So when I'm looking for impacts of World War I want you to be able to explain total war. And then after that, we have to explain the impacts after the war. And that's when we'll get into things like the Treaty of Versailles and other effects that World War I is going to have after the war is over. So that's it. That's what I wanted you to know, right? You got a lot of good information to work with. I hope all that's interesting. And if you have questions, please let me know. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thank you.